When did you realize you married a monster? My husband and I had been trying to get pregnant unsuccessfully for over a year. When I was diagnosed as infertile, Mark didn't even pause before saying, "Good thing we have other options in the family." By the time I could even ask what he meant, the doorbell had rung. My sister Sierra walked in wearing a very low-cut dress. She instantly hugged my husband for way too long. "I'm so honored to be your surrogate," she gushed while staring at him. Mark's mother was suddenly in my living room too, setting up what looked like a PowerPoint on our TV. "This is an intervention," Mark announced, guiding Sierra to sit next to him. When his hand landed on her thigh, something cold settled in my chest. His mother clicked through slides about family bloodlines while Sierra kept touching Mark's arm, giggling at things that weren't even funny. The thing was, Sierra had been obsessed with Mark since our wedding day. She'd always found excuses to visit, always needed his help with something. "Claire, you know how much having a biological child means to me," Mark said, his voice taking on that tone he used when he wanted something. "Sierra's offering us a gift. The baby would still look like you, still be part of your family." Sierra leaned forward, practically spilling out of her dress. "I'll move in during the process so we can bond as a family unit." Mark was already pulling out his phone. "She'll need the guest room by tonight." Sierra squealed and started planning where her things would go. His mother was discussing ovulation calendars. I opened my mouth, but no one was looking at me anymore. Sierra moved in that night with 3 suitcases. Johnny, Mark's college roommate, stopped by that first week. "I told my mom about your guys' arrangement, and she made me promise to check in on you," he said, watching Sierra prance around in Mark's shirt. I just nodded and shut the door. The trying had begun immediately. He'd kiss my forehead, tell me he loved me, then disappear into the guest room with her for hours. The first time, I stood in the hallway listening to her giggling. I had nowhere to go. Mark had taken out $50,000 in loans in my name for the IVF. If I left, I'd be bankrupt. I kept telling myself it was for our future family. But when I heard him groan her name, I ran to the bathroom and threw up. 3 more months passed. 3 months of Sierra calling him Marky. That's when Johnny started showing up more and more. Somehow he was the only one I could cry to without feeling pathetic. "This isn't normal, Claire," he said one afternoon, his voice gentle. "You know that, right?" I started crying so hard I couldn't breathe. The night my world shifted, I was at Johnny's apartment. We were watching BoJack Horseman, and simply from the way he looked at me, I remembered what it felt like to matter to someone. I was just about to lean in for a cheeky kiss when Johnny smiled. "You know what's weird? It usually doesn't take this long to get pregnant. I think he's in for a surprise." That's when my phone rang. It was Mark. When I picked up, he was sobbing so hard the phone kept cutting out. "The doctor, Sierra, he was hyperventilating. "She has the same infertility thing you have. It's genetic. Your whole maternal line." My heart stopped. "Claire, I'm so sorry. I need you. Please come home. We can figure something else out." The room was spinning. Johnny's hand found mine while Mark continued. "Claire, you're my wife. You'll help me fix this, right? You always fix everything." In the background, I could hear Sierra screaming about how he'd used her, how he'd promised her things. Mark's voice was desperate now. "Say something. Please. I love you." I laughed, but it sounded like broken glass. He was still begging for forgiveness when Johnny grabbed the phone and hung up. I expected him to say something reassuring. So Mark went through months of mediocre sex with Sierra just to end up back at square one. That's rough. I looked up at him and we both laughed like teenagers until I swear I could feel abs form under my stomach. That's when my phone buzzed again. This time it was Sierra. "He's kicking me out tonight. I have nowhere to go. Are you happy now?" I sent her screenshots of Mark saying, "Your sister is so desperate it's sad," from last Christmas. "Now you know who he really is." She opened it straight away, and I was still laughing when I turned my phone off and fell asleep on Johnny's chest. But when I woke up, I noticed my phone had been bombarded with dozens of texts and missed calls. The first voicemail was threatening. By the 10th, they were practically begging to talk about this rationally. My phone kept buzzing against Johnny's chest, and I grabbed it to see 30 more texts from Mark in just the last hour. The messages jumped between calling me a homewrecker for sending those screenshots to Sierra and begging me to come back so we could work things out. Johnny stirred awake and watched me scroll through the mess before suggesting I should probably check our bank accounts. I borrowed his laptop and logged into our joint accounts while he made coffee in the kitchen. The screen showed exactly what I'd been dreading. All $50,000 of IVF loans were in my name, with auto payments already scheduled to start next week. Mark had moved most of our savings into an account I couldn't access. My hands started shaking so bad I nearly dropped the laptop. Johnny came back with 2 mugs and saw my face go pale. He sat down next to me and offered to let me stay on his couch as long as I needed. We both agreed this wasn't about jumping into something new or rebounding from Mark. He made it clear my safety came first, and we shook hands on it like we were closing a business deal. I actually laughed for the first time in days. Throughout that first night on his couch, my phone kept lighting up with more messages. Mark's mother had joined in now, leaving voicemails that went from threatening me about the loans to crying about destroying the family legacy. Then they'd switch to accusing me of planning this all along. I started screenshotting every text and recording every voicemail, dumping them all into a folder on Johnny's computer that he labeled evidence. The next morning, I had to go back to the house for work clothes and my medications. Mark was there waiting in the living room, switching between sobbing about losing his chance at being a father and screaming that I'd ruined everything by sending those texts to Sierra. His mother sat in my kitchen going on about marriage vows and commitment while I grabbed my things from the bedroom. I ignored them both and filled a duffel bag with everything I could carry. That afternoon, I spent hours gathering every receipt and piece of paperwork I could find about the IVF loans and Sierra's 3-month stay. Johnny helped me scan everything and email it to a new Gmail account Mark didn't know about. The paper trail was worse than I thought. Every major decision had been made without my input, with my signature forged on half the documents. That night, I tried to sleep in the guest room at home, but Mark kept knocking on the door every hour, alternating between apologizing and demanding I talk to him. His mother was still there too, making herself comfortable in my living room like she owned the place. I packed another bag and drove back to Johnny's at 2 in the morning. He'd already set up the couch with fresh sheets and put a phone charger on the side table. It wasn't much, but it felt safer than my own house. First thing the next morning, I called a consumer legal aid hotline to figure out what to do about the fraudulent loans. The woman on the phone gave me a referral to an attorney who specialized in financial abuse cases. When I explained my situation to the intake coordinator, she didn't even sound surprised. She'd heard this story before. That afternoon, I met with the attorney, Samir Ortega, at his office downtown. He reviewed all my documents while I sat there trying not to cry. He explained that Mark's actions could constitute fraud and financial coercion, especially with the forged signatures. We could dispute the loans and work on credit protection at the same time. For the first time since this mess started, I felt like someone actually understood the legal nightmare I was trapped in. That evening, Sierra finally got through after calling me 15 times. She went back and forth between blaming me for ruining everything and admitting that Mark had promised her they'd be together once I was out of the picture. She confirmed he'd been telling her for months that our marriage was basically over, and he was just waiting for the right time to leave. I put her on speaker and started recording with her knowledge, adding another file to my growing evidence folder. 3 days later, I was sitting in Haven Reed's office, a small room with beige walls and a fake plant in the corner. She had me fill out paperwork while I waited, my hands shaking as I checked boxes about my mental state. When she finally called me in, I sat on her couch and started talking about Mark and Sierra like it was just some weird situation we needed to work through. Haven stopped me after 5 minutes and asked me to describe what happened without using words like complicated or misunderstanding. I tried again and she wrote notes on her yellow pad. She asked about the loans and I explained how Mark handled all our finances. She asked about Sierra moving in and I told her Mark said it was temporary. She kept asking these simple questions until I was crying so hard I couldn't see. She handed me tissues and waited. When I could breathe again, she looked at me and said what happened had a name. Financial abuse. Emotional abuse. Not a complicated situation. Abuse. I cried harder, but something in my chest loosened. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Mark's mother about a family meeting to discuss moving forward together as a unit. I typed back that I would only communicate through legal channels from now on. She responded immediately with a long message about how I was destroying the family bloodline and disappointing generations of tradition. I screenshotted everything and forwarded it to Samir without reading it twice. That night around 11, the buzzer at Johnny's building started going off. Someone was pressing every apartment trying to get in. Johnny looked at the security camera on his phone and there was Mark, pressing buttons and yelling into the speaker. Johnny told me to stay inside and went down to the lobby. I watched from the window as they talked on the sidewalk, Mark waving his arms around. I called the police and explained my husband was violating our separation agreement. Mark saw Johnny pull out his phone and got in his car before the cops showed up. The officer took my statement and gave me a case number for documentation. Samir called the next morning saying he'd submitted requests to all the loan companies and the IVF clinic for complete records including IP addresses and timestamps. He needed to prove the signatures were forged. Within 2 days, the preliminary data came back. Several loan applications were submitted from Mark's work computer during hours when I was clocked in at my own job across town. One was even submitted while I was documented as being at a conference in another state. Samir said this was exactly what we needed to prove fraud. My second therapy session with Haven focused on patterns. She had me map out every time I'd fixed something for Mark, solved a problem, made peace between him and others. The list covered 3 pages. She asked me to identify what I got from being the fixer. I said it made me feel needed. She asked what would happen if I stopped fixing things. I said everything would fall apart. She asked if that was my responsibility. I couldn't answer. We spent the rest of the session practicing saying no to different scenarios she gave me. It was harder than I expected. My throat would close up and I'd start explaining why I couldn't say no. She'd stop me and we'd try again. By the end I could say it, but my whole body was tense. That Saturday evening, Johnny made pasta while I sat at his kitchen counter. We both knew there was something between us, but neither of us wanted to mess things up. He said he wasn't trying to be another problem in my life. He said he could wait until I was ready, even if that took months or years. He said seeing me as a whole person, not someone who needed saving, was what mattered. We agreed to take things slow. Really slow. Like maybe just being friends who happened to have feelings they weren't acting on yet. It felt safe. The next morning, Sierra sent me screenshots that made my stomach turn. Texts between her and Mark's mother from 3 weeks before the intervention. They'd planned everything. What Sierra should wear, when to touch Mark's arm, even specific phrases to use about family bonding. Mark's mother had coached her on how to act around me, how to make the surrogacy seem like Sierra's idea. The timestamp showed they'd been planning this for over a month. I forwarded everything to Samir immediately. He called within an hour saying this was huge for proving conspiracy and premeditation. 2 days later, Mark's mother called my phone directly. I was distracted and answered without checking the number. She launched into this speech about family traditions and how her grandmother was a surrogate for her aunt back in the 40s. She said this was their family's noble heritage and I was spitting on generations of tradition. She said Mark deserved a son to carry on the family name. I hung up and blocked her number on everything. That night, Mark sent an email with apology in the subject line. It started with him saying sorry, but quickly turned into something else. He mentioned my anxiety medication from 2 years ago. He brought up the time I had a panic attack at his company party. He said he was worried about my mental stability and maybe we should handle this privately instead of through courts. He said he still loved me, but was concerned about what people would think if they knew about my issues. Samir told me to save everything and not respond. He said the veiled threats actually helped our case by showing Mark's pattern of manipulation and intimidation. The next week, Samir filed formal disputes with all 3 loan servicers and started building a harassment log. He had me document every text, call, email, and contact attempt with timestamps and screenshots. The paperwork was overwhelming. Forms for each loan company, affidavits about the forged signatures, statements about the harassment. I spent hours filling out documents, scanning evidence, organizing files, but having a plan, having steps to follow, made the anxiety manageable. Each form I completed felt like taking back a piece of control. Samir said we were building an airtight case and to keep documenting everything no matter how small it seemed. 3 days later, I was back at the house with Johnny and 2 police officers to grab more of my stuff. Mark was there, but the officers kept him in the living room while I went through rooms collecting clothes and documents. I pushed open the door to what used to be our spare room and froze. It was a nursery. Pale yellow walls with little ducks painted along the border. A white crib already assembled in the corner. The changing table had diapers stacked on it. I felt sick looking at it all. Johnny came up behind me and started taking photos with his phone while I dug through the dresser drawers. That's when I found them. Receipts from a baby furniture store dated the day after Sierra moved in, 3 months ago. The crib, the changing table, even a rocking chair that wasn't set up yet. All ordered while I was still living here thinking we were trying for our family together. I stuffed the receipts in my bag and grabbed the rest of my winter clothes from the closet. The next morning, I had another session with Haven at her office downtown. She pulled out a blank notebook and started drawing boxes on a page. "We're making you a safety plan," she said. She had me write down 5 emergency contacts, people I could call day or night if things got bad. Then we made scripts for different situations. What to say if Mark showed up at my work. How to respond if his mother called again. Exit plans for if I ran into them at the grocery store. She had me practice saying no to different things she threw at me. "Can you just come home so we can talk?" "No. Your sister needs you right now." "No. You're being unreasonable about this." "No." My throat kept closing up and I'd start explaining why I couldn't help, but she'd stop me and make me try again. By the end, I could say it without my voice shaking, but my whole body was tense. She gave me homework to use 1 boundary phrase each day for a week. 2 days passed before Sierra texted asking to meet. Johnny told me not to go, but I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near the mall. She was already there when I arrived, wearing regular clothes for once instead of something revealing. Her eyes were puffy and red. She started talking before I even sat down, saying she really thought Mark loved her, that he'd promised her a future together after I was out of the picture. She asked if I knew any good therapists because she needed to talk to someone. I pulled out my phone and forwarded her some resources Haven had given me, but told her straight up I couldn't be her support system through this. She nodded and stared at her coffee, and we sat there for 5 minutes not talking before I left. That evening, I was at Johnny's apartment making dinner when I brought up something that had been bothering me. I told him I needed to be careful about leaning on him too much, that I didn't want to jump from one relationship to another without dealing with my stuff first. He put down the spatula and really listened. "How about we limit hanging out to twice a week while you sort everything out?" he suggested. It stung a little, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. We shook on it like adults and went back to making pasta. The next afternoon, a thick envelope arrived from the loan company with all the records Samir had requested. I spent 3 hours going through every page with a highlighter. The IP addresses showed multiple applications submitted from Mark's work computer during times I was clocked in at my job across town. One application was submitted while I was visiting my parents in another state. I had the plane tickets to prove it. The signatures were electronic, but the timestamps didn't match up with anything I actually signed. Samir called it our smoking gun when I emailed him the highlighted sections. Mark started posting on social media the next day. Vague stuff about being betrayed by people close to him, and learning who his real friends were. My phone started buzzing with messages from mutual friends asking what was going on. I typed the same response to everyone that we were handling things privately, and left it at that. Setting that boundary felt good even though I knew people were definitely talking about us. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about good times with Mark, our first date at that Thai place, the surprise birthday party he threw me 2 years ago, how he used to bring me coffee in bed on Sundays. Instead of spiraling, I got up and grabbed a notebook. I wrote out everything that happened in order, just the facts without any feelings. Sierra moving in, the secret nursery, the forged signatures. Seeing it all written down in black and white helped separate what I wished was true from what actually happened. The facts were bad enough without my emotions making them fuzzy. The next week, I found out my credit score had tanked so bad, I couldn't qualify for an apartment lease anywhere. The loan defaults Mark caused dropped me almost 200 points. Johnny offered to co-sign, but I needed to do this myself. I'd figure something out even if it meant staying on his couch longer than planned. Samir helped me open new bank accounts at a different bank and walked me through setting up credit freezes with all 3 bureaus. We put fraud alerts on everything and changed every password I had. Each little step felt huge, even though we were basically starting from scratch. "This is a marathon, not a sprint," he kept saying. 2 mornings later, Johnny called me from his front door. Mark had left something on his doorstep overnight. Our wedding album with every photo of me cut out, just my shape missing from all the pictures. Johnny took photos of everything before I even saw it, documenting the album, the doorstep, even the security camera footage of Mark leaving it at 3 in the morning. We filed another police report that afternoon. Haven said the escalation was concerning but not unexpected given everything else. The hearing was set for 2 days later at the courthouse downtown. I got there early and sat in the hallway checking my phone while Samir reviewed his notes beside me. Mark showed up 20 minutes before we were scheduled with his mother, but no lawyer. Both of them dressed like they were going to church. His mother kept trying to make eye contact with me while Mark paced back and forth near the water fountain. When they called our case number, we all filed into the small courtroom where the judge was already reviewing the paperwork. Mark started talking before anyone asked him to, saying this was all a big misunderstanding and that married couples work through problems together. The judge cut him off and asked if he had legal representation. Mark said he didn't need a lawyer for something this ridiculous. His mother stood up from the gallery and started saying something about young people not understanding commitment, but the bailiff told her to sit down. The judge went through each incident I'd documented, the wedding album with my photos cut out, showing up at Johnny's place at 3 in the morning, the dozens of calls and texts. Mark kept interrupting to explain his side, but the judge warned him twice about speaking out of turn. After reviewing everything, the judge granted a temporary protective order for 30 days with a full hearing scheduled for next month. Mark had to stay 500 feet away from my home and workplace. His face turned red and he started to say something, but his mother grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. 3 days later, a thick envelope showed up at Johnny's apartment addressed to me with no return address. Inside was a 5-page handwritten letter from Mark's mother on her fancy stationery about the sanctity of marriage and how I was destroying generations of family tradition. She went on about how her grandmother and great-grandmother all stayed married through difficult times and that modern women didn't understand sacrifice. The last page had a family tree she'd drawn showing all the successful marriages in their bloodline. I scanned every page and emailed them to Samir without reading them again. Haven said during our next session that not engaging with manipulation was actually a form of taking back power. That same afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Sierra saying she'd found a friend's couch to crash on for a while and had gotten a part-time job at a clothing store in the mall. Her message was longer than usual, talking about how she was sorry for her part in everything and that she'd been stupid to believe Mark's promises. She said she was seeing things more clearly now and hoped maybe someday we could talk. I stared at the message for a while before typing back 2 words, "Good luck," and leaving it at that. Samir called me into his office the next morning to go over the divorce paperwork. He spread out all these documents on his conference table explaining how we'd address the fraudulent debts and seek something called indemnification, which meant Mark would have to take legal responsibility for the loans he forged. The legal language made my head spin, but Samir walked through each section showing me where to initial and sign. My hand was steady when I signed the papers, which surprised me since I thought I'd be more emotional about officially ending my marriage. Johnny had made dinner at his place that night and I could tell something was on his mind. After we finished eating, he said we needed to talk about boundaries and him maybe pulling back a bit to let me stand on my own feet. It stung hearing it even though I knew he was right. He said he cared about me but didn't want me jumping from one dependency to another without dealing with my stuff first. We agreed to limit hanging out to just weekly coffee check-ins for a while. I nodded and tried not to show how much it hurt, even though it was exactly what I needed. Through a coworker who was moving, I found out about a tiny studio sublet that was month to month and actually within my budget. The place was cramped with water stains on the ceiling and the radiator clanged all night, but it had a working lock and nobody else's name was on the lease. I signed the papers that afternoon and moved in 2 days later with just my clothes, some dishes, and a sleeping bag Johnny let me borrow. The first week in my own place went okay until Thursday night when I was heating up soup and suddenly couldn't breathe. My chest got tight and my hands started shaking and I thought I was having a heart attack. I sat on the floor of my tiny bathroom using the breathing exercises Haven had taught me, counting to 4 on the inhale, holding for 4, releasing for 4. I got through it without calling anyone, which felt like a small victory, even though I cried afterwards. The next Monday I was walking to my car after work when Mark appeared from behind a van in the parking lot. I immediately pulled out my phone and started recording while walking straight toward the security booth. He followed me saying he just wanted to talk, that we could work this out if I'd stop being so stubborn. I didn't respond and kept walking while he got louder saying I was ruining his life over nothing. The security guard came out and told Mark to leave. Mark said he had a right to be there, but the guard called the actual police. They showed up within 10 minutes and gave Mark an official warning about violating the protective order. My employer agreed to have security walk me to my car for the next few weeks. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but Samir had told me to answer everything in case it was legal stuff. It was the loan servicing company calling to tell me they were freezing all collection attempts while they investigated the fraud claim. The woman on the phone said they'd found enough red flags to warrant a full investigation, and that I wouldn't see any more auto drafts from my account for now. Samir had warned me not to get too excited since these things could take months to fully resolve, but I still felt relief knowing those payments would stop hitting my account. That Friday night, Sierra sent me a voice memo through text with a message saying I needed to hear this. I played it and heard Mark's mother's voice giving Sierra detailed instructions about the intervention, telling her exactly when to touch Mark's arm, when to lean forward, what to say about being honored to help. The timestamp on the recording showed it was from 2 weeks before they'd ambushed me with their plan. Mark's mother even mentioned practicing the whole thing so it would seem spontaneous. I forwarded the recording to Samir immediately, and he replied within minutes saying this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to show premeditation and conspiracy. 3 weeks later, I was standing in my old driveway with a police officer beside me and a moving truck behind us. Mark opened the door before we even knocked, and his face went through about 6 different emotions in 2 seconds. The officer explained we were there for the property retrieval as scheduled by the court, and Mark needed to let me gather my belongings without interference. Mark started talking about how this was still his house too, and I couldn't just take whatever I wanted, but the officer cut him off and said the court order was clear about what I could retrieve. We walked inside, and the place looked like a tornado had hit it with dishes piled in the sink, and clothes thrown everywhere, and empty beer bottles on every surface. I started in the bedroom grabbing my clothes and jewelry while Mark followed me from room to room trying to get me to look at him. He kept switching between crying about how sorry he was and getting mad about how I'd ruined his life, and his mother was suddenly there too, shouting from the front yard about family values and disappointment. The officer told her twice to step back from the property line, and when she didn't listen, he called for backup. I kept my head down and focused on boxing up my grandmother's china and my books, and the painting my dad had given me before he died. Mark grabbed my arm when I reached for our wedding album, and I just looked at him until he let go. His mother was still yelling when we loaded the last box, and I noticed the neighbors were all watching from their windows. The whole thing took 3 hours, and I didn't say a single word the entire time. 2 days after that, Samir called me into his office for the first settlement discussion, which happened through a conference call with Mark's new lawyer. I told them straight up that Mark needed to take responsibility for all the fraudulent debt since he'd forged my signature and taken out loans without my knowledge. Mark's lawyer said his client couldn't afford to assume that much debt and suggested we split it 50-50, which made me laugh out loud. Samir muted our side and reminded me this was just the opening negotiation, and to stay firm on what I needed, which was complete removal from those loans. The call went on for 2 hours with them trying different angles, like saying I'd benefited from the money, even though it went to fertility treatments I never wanted or agreed to. We ended without any agreement, but Samir said that was normal, and we'd established our position clearly. That same week, Sierra called asking if we could meet at a coffee shop, and I almost said no, but something in her voice sounded different. She showed up looking tired and thin, and asked straight out if she could stay with me for a while since she had nowhere else to go. I pulled out my phone and showed her a list I'd already made of local shelters and housing assistance programs and support groups for people dealing with manipulation and financial abuse. She started crying and said she thought I'd help her since we were sisters, but I explained that I couldn't be her safety net while I was still trying to build my own. I gave her the number for a therapist who specialized in family trauma and told her about a women's center that helped with job placement. She nodded and said she understood, and we sat there for another 10 minutes not really talking before she left. The boundary felt right, even though part of me felt guilty watching her walk away. A few days later, I was checking my credit report online when I saw a new delinquent account that shouldn't have been there. I called the credit bureau and they said a loan servicer had reported me as 60 days past due, even though there was an active fraud investigation on that account. The first person I talked to said I needed to contact the loan company, but the loan company said I needed to dispute it with the credit bureau. I spent the next 6 hours on the phone getting transferred between departments and put on hold and having to explain the whole situation over and over to people who didn't seem to care. One person hung up on me after I'd been explaining for 20 minutes and I had to start all over. By hour 4, I was sitting on my bathroom floor with the phone on speaker, just trying not to cry from frustration. Finally got someone who actually knew what they were doing and filed the dispute properly, and they said it would be removed within 30 days. I handled the whole thing myself without calling Johnny or anyone else for help, which felt like a small victory even though I was exhausted. My next therapy session with Haven was different because she wanted to talk about reframing what success looked like for me. She said I kept expecting perfect justice where Mark would face all the consequences and I'd get complete vindication, but that wasn't how these things usually worked. We talked about how success could mean achieving safety and autonomy even if Mark never fully paid for what he did. She helped me see that some things wouldn't be resolved neatly, and that was normal and okay. Progress wasn't always linear, and sometimes protecting yourself was more important than getting revenge. I left feeling lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying weight I didn't need. That night, Johnny texted asking if I wanted to come to a small party with his friends that weekend, but I told him I needed to focus on preparing for the upcoming mediation. He texted back saying he was proud of me for prioritizing what I needed, and that he'd check in after the mediation was done. Having someone respect my boundaries without trying to convince me otherwise or making me feel bad about it felt completely new. The preliminary divorce hearing happened 2 weeks later in a small courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee. Mark showed up with a new lawyer who immediately tried to paint me as vindictive and money-hungry, but the judge cut him off and said he'd reviewed the evidence already. The hearing itself only took 40 minutes, with the judge ordering us to attend mediation and extending the protective order for another year. Mark kept trying to make eye contact with me, but I just stared at the table in front of me. His lawyer asked for more time to prepare for mediation, but the judge said we'd had plenty of time already, and set the date for the following month. During mediation, Mark finally admitted to forging my signature on the loan documents, but then immediately started talking about how we could work through this as a couple. He said counseling could help us rebuild trust, and we could start fresh somewhere new and maybe even try adoption. I looked him straight in the eye and said divorce was the only option, and there was no possibility of reconciliation. His face changed completely when he realized I actually meant it, and for a second he looked like a stranger. The mediator had to call a break when Mark started raising his voice about how I was throwing away our marriage over a misunderstanding. 3 days after mediation, Sierra sent me a text saying Mark's mother had cut her off completely and was spreading rumors about her at their church and in their social circle. She said she was staying in counseling twice a week and keeping her retail job, and had found a room to rent from an older woman who needed help with groceries. I felt bad for her but kept my response simple with just a thumbs up emoji. The boundary was holding even though it was hard. The next week, the loan servicing company called to say they were moving toward removing my liability based on all the evidence of fraud we'd submitted. Samir had warned me not to get too excited since these things could change, but the trajectory was positive, and they said a final decision would come within 60 days. I decided I couldn't keep reading Mark's messages anymore, so Johnny helped me set up filters on my email that sent everything from him straight to a folder for Samir to review later. My phone got the same treatment with blocking apps and redirects that meant I never saw his texts or calls come through. The constant buzzing stopped and I could actually focus on work without jumping every time my phone lit up. 2 days later, I was doing laundry in my tiny studio's shared basement when this wave of grief hit me out of nowhere. I found myself crying over a shirt Mark had bought me for our anniversary, and suddenly I was writing him this long letter on the back of a laundry receipt about everything I wished I could say. Back in my studio, I grabbed a metal bowl from the kitchen and lit the letter on fire with the stove burner. The smoke alarm started screaming immediately, and I had to wave a dish towel at it while the paper turned to ash. But watching those words disappear felt like letting go of something heavy. The court hearing for the protective order extension happened the next week, and the judge barely looked up from the paperwork before granting it for a full year. Mark wasn't allowed within 500 feet of my home or workplace, and the final divorce settlement got scheduled for 6 weeks out. Walking out of the courthouse knowing I had legal protection for a whole year made my shoulders drop from my ears for the first time in months. I found a support group for financial abuse survivors that met Tuesday nights in a church basement downtown. The first meeting, I just sat there listening to other people's stories and realizing how many of us there were. The facilitator mentioned an art class at the community center, and I signed up that same night even though I hadn't painted since college. Haven smiled when I told her about both things at our next session, and said this was what healing looked like when you stopped just surviving and started actually living again. The divorce settlement happened on a rainy Thursday morning, and Mark showed up with his lawyer looking smaller somehow. The judge reviewed everything, and Mark had to sign papers taking full responsibility for the $50,000 in IVF debt plus provide written indemnification, protecting me from any future claims. The asset split was basic since we didn't have much, but I got my grandmother's jewelry back and half our small savings. Samir shook my hand afterward and told me I should be proud of how I'd fought for myself through all of this. That weekend, I invited Johnny over to my studio for dinner for the first time. I made spaghetti with jarred sauce and a bagged salad because that's all I could manage. But we ate at my tiny table with mismatched plates, and it felt like the most normal thing in the world. We talked about taking things slow and dating properly this time without all the crisis and drama. When he left that night, the kiss was soft and careful, without any of the desperate need that had defined my whole marriage to Mark. 3 days later, Sierra sent me a photo of herself in a Target uniform with just the words, "Doing better," underneath. I stared at it for a while, then sent back a thumbs up emoji and left it at that. We'd found this distance that worked where we weren't enemies, but we weren't sisters either. And maybe that was the best we could hope for. 3 months after that awful night at Johnny's when everything fell apart, my credit score had climbed back to the low 600s, and I'd gotten a secured credit card to keep rebuilding. Mark's mother stayed blocked on everything, and I'd heard from a mutual friend that Mark had started seeing a therapist, which honestly surprised me. Johnny and I were dating for real now, with actual dates and boundaries and conversations about the future that didn't feel rushed or desperate. The debt was completely gone from my name, and the divorce was final with the papers filed away in a folder marked Old Life that I kept in a box under my bed. I wasn't happy in that big dramatic way I used to perform for everyone, but I had this quiet feeling of being okay that belonged just to me and didn't need anyone else's approval or validation. That's today's wrap-up. I like to share stories, but the real value is when you walk away with something useful. Hopefully this gave you a little takeaway to keep in mind. Subscribe so the next one's waiting for you.